All right, welcome back everyone for another fun-filled edition of Goethe's Faust. We're going to cover a lot today. I hope this is going to be another exciting time for discussion and insights and sort of a collective dialogue on Faust. So the way we're going to do this, we'll try to stick with the same type of setup. I will try to go over kind of the highlights of what we've read and maybe mention a couple of things that stood out to me. Then I'll pass the floor to Doug and Allison, and then we'll just open it up to everyone. If you've read the book, feel free to share, ask questions, comment on what's already been said. It's all good. We'll try to make it as interactive as possible. Let's see here, a couple more people are showing up. Great. Okay, so this section that we've read for this meetup started with a very interesting scene called Aerbach Cellar at Leipzig. Very lively scene. If you remember in the introduction, where we had the director, the jester, and the poet, we said that it looks like we're going to be switching modes between poetic, idealistic versus more kind of jocular and entertaining scenes. So this is definitely a transition to one of these more entertaining and more interactive scenes, let's put it this way. And again, Goethe just is such a versatile writer. He's able to communicate both the kind of the epic seriousness of the subject, but also be able, you can switch gears very quickly and get us into this mode of a bar scene with these small bourgeois types that are just enjoying themselves, having a time of their life. And then Faust and Mephistopheles spring on them, and we have this interesting interaction with that. A couple of thoughts I had as I was reading this, I guess some parallels. One, maybe obvious, maybe not. I was thinking of Dionysus, because we're at a bar, and we have this Mephistopheles is spontaneously producing wine. It's very Dionysian, very much of echoes Euripides, some of the other stories of Dionysus. I was thinking, well, Doug, I don't know if you remember that story on where Dionysus is on a ship incognito, and then they're captured by pirates, and then he makes also turns the waters into wine and makes the vine, the grapes grow, and it's just very much of a reminiscent type of scene with this one, right? Where we also have Mephistopheles kind of offering, "Hey guys, what kind of wine would you like?" And they're not sure what he's talking about. Anyway, I thought that was interesting. The other parallel that I thought of, maybe from a different, more again, sacred versus profane, more sacred vein, is the Jesus at the wedding in Cana. And this was in John 2, but the same exact setup, almost exactly the same, where Jesus turns water into wine. So another familiar, but this is obviously, if anything, a caricature of that, because you have the devil now, and all he's doing is he's not really there to provide any sort of benefit. He's amusing himself, but interesting parallel nonetheless, maybe. I'll be curious what you think about that. But stepping back a little bit, I think we finished last time talking about Faust and his unbounded desire to experience everything, and so now we're on this program of experiencing everything. And the devil starts this program with kind of the most basic. I was thinking of Maslow's pyramid, basic needs and wants, right? So what is the first thing everybody wants? Is eat, drink, and be merry. And this is where we start. We start with kind of a lowest common denominator. Everybody enjoys a beer. Everybody enjoys a drink, some company. And then Mephistopheles provides a description of that type of lifestyle. He says, it's not a bad way to live. You know, they're not asking for stars from heaven, but they're not depressed either. And they're just chasing their tail. Nothing is happening. There's no progress being made, but everybody's just having a good time. So that's the kind of the our starting point here. Let's see, got another person coming in. Okay. So that's Aerbach's Cellar at Leipzig. And then we transition to another very interesting scene, the witch's kitchen. And this is the scene where you have these animals, the apes, monkeys, whatever you want to call them, stirring this big cauldron, making a potion for rejuvenating Faust, making him younger. And I was thinking also as I was reading this, it's such an interesting contemporary theme. My wife, she buys all kinds of products, you know, creams and all these things, you know, to keep her young and to sort of do this rejuvenation. And in some ways, it's also magic, right? We don't know what's in these things, and it's all about trying to, you know, the sense of, you know, we don't like the limitations, and that's the theme here that keeps coming up. It's a recurrent theme, right? The limitations of nature and magic as a way to counter that. And of course, magic and science in some ways are very similar in that both are able to take a natural process and transmute it into something else. And the question, of course, is it worth it? You know, is the price tag worth it? And there's always a price tag. So for Faust, he is nearly 50 years old. And well, we can kind of surmise that because he says he wants to be at least 30 years younger. So naturally, he doesn't want to be probably a teenager. So he's around 50, a scholar. And this potion is gonna do just that. It's gonna provide him with this magical rejuvenation, but also apparently it's gonna be an aphrodisiac of sorts, which begs the question, how real are his affinities for Gretchen, for Margaret, Gretchen being the diminutive of Margaret. So that's another question that I thought we might touch upon. Let's see, some more people coming in. All right, but there again, as the potion is being brewed, Faust is initially repelled by this whole process. It's a little bit unnatural to him. He doesn't like it, and he says, "Is there any other way?" And Mephistopheles says, "Sure, you can go to a farm, and you can, you can wake up with the beasts and spread manure." And of course, it's wonderful in some ways to get a sense of his wit and his sarcasm, because he offers something to Faust that he already knows Faust is not going to accept. And Faust makes a very pointed remark that he says, and I don't know in your how it's translated in your translation, but in my translation it says, "The narrow life has no appeal to me." That's what he said. The narrow life. So a life that is hedged in, the life that it has inherent limits, as a farmer's life certainly has limits. In fact, probably symbolize kind of the epitome of a limited life, right? You're tied to the farm, you're tied to your animals, you're tied to the cycles of nature. There's nothing you can do, and everything about Faust is getting out of that game and being unlimited, boundless, unhedged by anything. And of course, Mephistopheles plays on that. So very interesting themes in these jocular scenes that are being referenced. A quick reference also to Shakespeare. You probably have picked up on this, that the scene smacks a little bit of Macbeth, and the witch is there. And of course, the incantations, double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn, and cauldron bubble. Very similar to some of those incantations that the witch and the animals are mumbling. Just another quick interesting reference is this magic mirror, where Faust sees an image, and it's initially, you haven't read it, you think, well, that's probably Gretchen, but it actually is Helen, who we shall meet in part 2. So Helen is a emblem of female beauty, the apex of that. Okay, so so we've talked about Aerbach's cellar, which is kitchen, and now we meet Gretchen herself. So they're out on a walk, Faust and Mephistopheles. They meet Gretchen, returning from church, returning from a confession. Who is Gretchen? So she is pretty much a kid. Faust says she is over 14, but probably not much older than that. So she's 14 years old. She lives with her mother. She's a very, I would say, typical church-going, middle class or lower middle class young woman in that small town where she finds herself in. And here's Faust dressed up in his exotic attire with Mephistopheles, who's also sporting a hat and some feathers in his cap, and they're like a very interesting pair. And of course, as soon as Faust accosts her, then but following the custom, she repels him, but she's very much intrigued, and it's almost irresistible for her to meet somebody of Faust's stature. I do want to mention one historical motif that probably influenced Goethe in writing this. And by the way, everything that has to do with Gretchen is Goethe's unique addition to the legend of Dr. Faustus. So none of this was present in Marlowe's Faust, and none of this was present in Faust book, which was the kind of the basis for all these stories. So everything about Margaret is Goethe's own invention. It makes a lot of sense too, because of his own life story, his own involvement with women, the romantic period that he's in. I mean, all of this really makes a lot of sense that this scene and this motif is included. And in fact, it's probably the most famous part of Faust that everybody's familiar with, is the seduction of Gretchen and the tragedy of Gretchen. But another thing that's interesting is that while in Goethe's lifetime, and in, especially in his tenure under, and I forget the guy's name now, but as he had his post at the small, I guess, duchy in Germany, there was a woman who was sentenced for infanticide. Her name was Susanna Margareta Brandt. And Goethe apparently, not only was he aware of this, but he also had to cast some vote whether or not she would be condemned. And apparently he did condemn her as well for infanticide to be executed. There's some questions about that, but bottom line is it was definitely a custom at that time, and it was a brutal one, and Goethe was intimately involved and knew very, very well these cases, which were apparently pretty common, of women getting involved outside of wedlock and then not being able to provide for their children. They would kill their children and then would be caught and sentenced. Of course, this also, I was thinking, parallels some of the American literature with the Scarlet Letter, and some of the even the witch trials in Salem. I mean, there's just a lot of parallels from that period that come to mind as we read this. So, okay. I'm wondering if we should maybe stop here, and then we'll come back to some of the other, basically the ending of the story. I'm very curious to hear some of you and what you think about this, and maybe we can kind of break it up into two parts, kind of the initial introduction of Faust and Mephistopheles, how it all happens, and then we can go into discussing what happens in the end and how the story develops. So with that said, Doug, do you want to maybe say a few words on that front, and just curious that your general impressions and just any other comments you might want to make?
Well, I'll say a couple of things. I like that you brought up Dionysus. I think that's really apt. And it made me think I'm going to put a Wikipedia article on it, Nietzsche's book, The Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music, in which he talks about the Dionysian and the Apollonian and, as both elements in tragedy. And it's a pretty fascinating essay. And really should go back to it periodically because or more often, but it's had but I realize Faust and Goethe and, although Schiller and Schopenhauer may have been a bigger influence on that, but as I read this, and I'm a little behind in the reading, I've read it before in different translations. This translation you recommended, is it Greenberg or I think is very good. And once you catch the rhythm of it, I think there's a lot of humor in it. It goes, I think, to the vulgar elements in the script very quickly, and then goes to the poetry, and then goes to some philosophy. And I think that kind of sparkling kind of contrast, which I think some of the German writers really picked up out of Shakespeare, where there's some great poetry and then suddenly a crude joke. And I think Goethe really masters that. But it's hard. It's hard to find a translation that really captures that. There have been some theater companies, the Citizens Company in Glasgow, which did an adaptation of it in real theatrical terms and wanted to create a way to do the whole show in one evening, although I think they often performed it on separate evenings. But it's it's sort of like Mozart's Magic Flute, which is done as a great philosophical work, but in fact, it was a beer hall entertainment when he wrote it. He was writing this sort of great solemn work, which has admittedly great comic elements, but everybody takes that so seriously. But it was basically cabaret entertainment in German beer halls. And so Faust really captures that, I think, really well, where the devil can drill holes in the table and give people spigots and they can pour whatever drink they most want, whether it's champagne or beer or wine or sweet wine or dry wine or, whatever is your taste, you can get it. But then it starts spewing fire. It goes back to almost that medieval use of fire to scare humans and very devilish. And so the Apollonian, the Dionysian is very interesting. And something I didn't realize until recently is that the Greeks, the oracle at Delphi during the summer, warmer months was controlled by the sun and Apollo, and the rituals, the temple was dedicated to Apollo. During the winter months, it was dedicated to Dionysus. So the great writers tend to always find this weird mix between the, fertility, sexual, erotic elements, and then the mind and the spirit in a kind of dialogue and counterpoint. And I like this translation because I think it really flies quickly from one to the other. And, and just interesting insights, you give someone a box of jewelry and they're suddenly excited, and she's not a woman who actually is dedicated to that stuff at all, but it's given to her and she goes, wow, this is beautiful. And it creates, but the echoes of energy, from this room that Goethe or Faust sees as having a lovely spirit to it, and then she walks in and she goes, this is the most oppressive room I've ever been in, because Faust and the devil have been in the room. That shifting of a psychological space, the same space, taking on very different psychological energies, depending on who last left it, is a really interesting. And so it echoes a lot with Frankenstein too, because that idea of the spirit of a place is always recurring in this, as it does in Frankenstein. That there is a spirit, that each locale has a sort of spirit.
Absolutely.
And the mountains, and I knew a dancer once who spent some time in Germany teaching movement and psychology, movement therapy, dance therapy to heroin addicts in Germany in a center. But she'd go to these little German towns, and she said some places were unbelievably beautiful, and other places you just feel a spirit of darkness that goes back to the medieval period. And she said she could feel that something terrible had happened in the city hundreds of years before her visit there. But it's like it lingered in the walls. There was of the town. Certainly a lot of German writers write that way. So that's, I think that's enough to start on, but I think that the Apollonian Dionysian thing and the fact that Dionysus and Osiris and Dionysus and the life of Christ, they all echo similar themes of resurrection. Dionysus is torn apart, but he's resurrected. He's often sent out on a raft, I think. I'm trying to remember. I need to review all that again. But he's been cut up into pieces, but somehow he arrives back reassembled. And that's the story of Osiris too, where Isis has to find all the parts of Osiris and reanimates him. It's very strange how much and I think of the period of Goethe, and even that shows up in Dickens and Christmas Carol, the remix of Christian and pagan elements in literature that sort of got purged, the way the pagan libraries got burned, and then they re-entered Europe from the Arab libraries, and the libraries of the East saved them. And some of the libraries in Ireland saved some of the classics, but Europe basically burned their legacy, and it had to be re-imported from the East. And I think Goethe is right in the middle of that, and the German writers really were pulling in and very influenced by the Bhagavad Gita, and who then influenced the American transcendentalists through the Germans. So it's to go back into this is very interesting after not reading it for decades.
Yeah, one other point, thank you, Doug. One other point I wanted to make, if you've read Bulgakov's Master and Margarita, there's a similar scene there, which is borrowed from Goethe in a sense, where Voland, the character of Mephistopheles, offers the two writers a cigarette, and without opening his a box of cigars, asking them which cigar they prefer, well, from which country. And of course, the two of them look at him like, what are you talking about? But of course, it's the same type of setup where he produces these miraculous cigars. And then in a later scene, there's money being, real money being flown or produced in the circus. People take that money and then it turns into like bottle labels or something like that after it's been used to pay for something. So same kind of joking type of trickster atmosphere that we see in Aerbach's Cellar is mimicked by Bulgakov in a later sort of almost like a continuation, I would say, or adaptation of Faust into modern life, which also is an interesting way to do this. Allison, I'm curious, do you have any thoughts on the kind of what we've covered so far?
Yeah, I think that kind of the theme of this whole section is never let the devil be your wingman. And one of the things that I was thinking about as I read this, I had a child development class, and the professor asked, why do kids do bad things? And we all thought it was from like bad childhoods or all kinds of things. And she says, no, think back to your own life. Like, I don't know. And she said, because it's fun to be naughty. And it is. And I think the whole like appeal of the devil and all these things is that because it's forbidden fruit, and I think that, but the problem with this, especially at this era, is that there's no birth control, there's no legal abortion. And so we wind up with these devastating consequences for these women. And it seemed really timely to read this right now. And like, do we want to go back to this? And what really struck me most of all was the speech by Valentine when he, he calls her, he kept calling her a whore and a slut. And, and just kind of the unequal punishment of the Gretchen versus Faust. And, I mean, she's a very young girl and is, a middle-aged man who should know better, but she's the one who gets all of the, the shame. And it, it kind of goes back to, purity culture and shaming these women. And the thing is, it's easy to say, oh, well, this is long ago. And that's because they didn't have birth control. They didn't have this, they didn't have that. But then when you think of Bill Clinton, he's sort of like, oh, well, he couldn't help himself, a young girl. Oh, what's he going to do? Boys will be boys. And Monica got all of the group, and to this day is still shamed for it. I don't know. I mean, it's just very interesting how that theme, it just goes on and on and on, and that was the thing that really struck me the most, was that all the behavior of the men was just sort of like, isn't this fun? This is great. Isn't this fun? But then, when you look at how it affects her, it's tragic, really. It's just tragic. So that was the main thing. And I think Faust is presenting it that way for a reason, because he wants to show that, like, if you're going off and you're having all these, these pleasures of life, but there are very serious consequences to acting on those pleasures. And then the other thing that I thought about with this idea of the potion, and you think, well, it's just a potion. So, but it reminds me, I remember reading an article one time about elderly women who'd had husbands who cheated on them throughout their marriage. And then towards the end of their marriage, they finally felt like their marriages were better because the men's sex drive had, calmed down. But then they went out, they got Viagra and continued to cheat on their wives, even like in the nursing homes. So it had, very good consequences from those drugs, but also some negative ones that went along with it. So it kind of is interesting how some of these things just don't go away, just like, your wife with her lotion. It's like they're always promising youth forever. But youth doesn't last forever. And that was the other thing that I kept thinking of, is I thought, okay, so say if you're offered eternal life, which eternal life do you really want? Do you want to just keep adding on years at the end? Or do you want to be 20 again? And then I thought, I honestly can't think of a single age that I would want to be forever, because they all had really good things and they all had bad things. And I think kind of like what's nice about it is just when you sort of had enough of one era, you enter a different era of your life. So I don't know that there's any one of those eras, those ages, that I would want to be forever.
Right. Well, there's a very famous Greek myth about a person who asks the gods to grant him eternal life, but he forgets to ask for eternal youth. And of course, he becomes a emaciated old person, right? Basically on the brink of dying, but never actually dying. I forget the name of it, but yeah, that's a good point.
If you're like, if you think like 20, like sometimes when you're older, you're like, oh, I wish I was 20 again, because you're just thinking of like what you looked like, but you completely forget how neurotic most 20-year-olds are. They have no idea what's going on. What are they going to do with their life? And they're very like angst filled. So I don't know that anybody really wants to be 20 forever.
Right.
I wouldn't. I don't know.
Right. All right. Okay. Thank you, Allison. Madeline, go ahead. If you guys, if you want to say something, go ahead and type in exclamation point in the chat. It's easier for me that way to keep track of who was first. Madeline, go ahead.
Okay, sure. I liked the two songs in the beer hall scene. They were very funny. There was one really had a bit of political satire in it, the one about the rat. His paunch grew round as any burgers, as round as Dr. Martin Luther's. Then there was also the flea song. The king who had the flea and said he was a baron, and then he was a first minister, and then he hired all his relatives. These reminded me in a way of the The song in Demons, those little songs that the drunk guy used to make up.
Oh, yes, yes,
Yeah, his songs and his
yes.
no,
About the cockroaches in the glass, yes.
yes, the cockroaches in the glass, one of the more bizarre images from literature. Okay, so we're at the cellar. And that's pretty much it. We haven't moved past the cellar. But I did think there was one notable part, which was the part where Mephisto early on, Mephisto says to Faust, "These dolts can't ever recognize old Nick, even when he's got them by the neck." So in other words, people always fail to recognize evil when it's right, when they're in the midst of the action. It seems like this wonderful thing is happening and it's their own free will. Whatever it is they're doing, that they have a pretty good idea they shouldn't be doing. Except that these guys, they're really not doing anything wrong. They're just sitting around drinking and singing.
Goofing off, yeah.
Yeah. I thought what you said about the manure was very interesting. Because Faust did make it sound like a very unappealing offer. But if anyone here has read Candide, he and his entire company go through many hardships. And at the end, they finally settle down and they realize the secret to happiness is to just stay in one place and tend your garden. And so here's a point where, the devil is offering that to Faust. And then the last thing was you mentioned the theme of the limited life and how Faust yearns for the limitless. That's one of the themes in the ancient Chinese work, the Chuang-Tzu. It's among the first of the inner chapters are the themes of the limited and the limitless. Yeah.
Can you put that in the chat if you have a reference or a wiki entry?
I don't know if I'll have the reference, but I'll put the name of the book and.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay.
That
It's couched in terms of there's one where it's a small bird that lives contentedly. Little birds live contentedly in the bushes. They're hopping around, they're doing their little flights, they're eating seeds. And then they meet an enormous bird and who's going to fly across the ocean, some sort of mythological bird. And they think that the entire idea of the trip sounds terrible to them, that he's going to be exhausted and he's going to have to bring all this food and why would he want to leave? But he has an entirely different scope because, he's a giant miles wide bird. So his view of things is very different.
Yeah, the theme that I keep coming back to is the more limitless you are, what happens paradoxically is you have limits emerging where you did not expect them. You would not, and maybe limits is not the right word, but you have unintended consequences that you did not expect, and they just keep popping up everywhere. And of course, this story is just a perfect example of that, where we start out with a simple desire of Faust to experience life to the fullest. There's nothing sinister about that. There's nothing at all that would suggest that before we're done, we're going to have 3 or 4 dead people in our body count, right? But that's exactly what's happening, and it is fast too. It happens so quickly, and I guess I want to just go back to Doug. I see your hand. Let me just go back to the plot a little bit, just to kind of round out our reading for today. We start out with this idea of Faust enjoying life at a bar, which doesn't entice him very much, and understandably so. He's a man of intellect. He's a man of kind of passion, and it's not enough for him just to drown all of that in a glass of whiskey or wine. But then we take it a notch higher, and now it's emotional. It's relationships. He wants to experience a beautiful, innocent woman, her love and her affection, and be involved in that at any cost. And immediately we see how this develops into again, this tragedy of she poisons her mom unknowingly, but she does. She kills her child. Her brother is killed, and then she herself is sentenced to death. I mean, it's like this whole thing just unravels with an enormous speed, and it's just bam, bam. It's like a falling domino effect that comes out of nowhere seemingly. And I was also thinking that if you think of the 10 Commandments, how many of the 10 Commandments Faust broke before we're done with part two? I mean, part one. I think we basically broke at least 6 or 7. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not commit adultery. What's the other one? Well, covet is the last one. Thou shalt not covet. I mean, we're way beyond just simple agreement with the devil. We're breaking moral laws left and right. And the question I have as I read this is this an inevitability of type of worldview that says we should not be limited in any way? Is this just an inevitability of that, or is there some way we can rein it in? But it seems like almost an oxymoron, right? If you rein something in, then you're not unlimited anymore. If you want to be an Ubermensch, then you have to deal with the consequences of being an Ubermensch. And so that seems to be kind of almost like prefiguring Nietzsche and his idea of morality being kind of an imposition of slaves, of Christianity, and of all these sort of things that are holding us back. But then, of course, as soon as you start implementing it, horrendous things start to happen everywhere. So that seems to be, at least maybe, and I don't know, maybe my impression is a little bit colored because I've already read Nietzsche and these philosophers, but it seems that Goethe is very much in touch with the unintended consequences, and he's portraying this in a very dramatic way. And I'm just curious what your take on it is. Doug, go ahead.
The only thing I mentioned it briefly in another session, is I think Goethe's influence on a playwright who was the father of German Expressionism in the German theater, Frank Wedekind. His name was actually Benjamin Franklin Wedekind because he was the son of a very liberal man who had to leave the country, I think, at some point and came back. And so his father named him after Benjamin Franklin. But he was known as Frank Wedekind. And his plays are just wild, and they explore sexuality in the 1890s in very frank ways. And Spring Awakening, it was a Broadway musical, which is really wonderful, except for the ending, where they really kind of turn it into this sentimental youth anthem, which plays really well, I think, today. But the play ends with the young sort of lead in the play who's tried to help his friend understand what sexuality is about. He's very shy, he's very confused, and he ends up committing suicide. And Peter Lorre played that role when he was a young man in Germany. And he would show up with his head under his arm, and the head would be talking to Melchior, his friend, and trying to get him to commit suicide because his girlfriend has been killed in a botched abortion. His other friend has committed suicide, and so he's reaching his hand out. And that's the point where the man in the mask shows up, which is the life force. And Frank Wedekind played the role of the man in the mask. And he would lead Melchior back into life because he's so shocked by what has happened that he basically resurrects his energy and says, yes, these are terrible things and they shouldn't happen. And they happen often from a fear of life. So, but Melchior Moritz, the guy who commits suicide, says, I understand literature, I understand Faust, I understand these things, but I don't understand sexuality because nobody has taught them sexuality. He just knows the poetry of it. And Frank Wedekind took the poetry and really made it overt. There are scenes in reform schools, there are scenes, I mean, it's like he's writing today in terms of the brash sexuality. And I had a voice teacher who lived next door to his family when she was a kid. And his wife had been a circus performer, and they had a globe, and she played with their children. And they had a globe, and the wife would get up on this globe and do dances on top of this globe. So this wild theatricality he kind of inherited from Goethe, but really made it very overt. You know, the thing where you have to read into certain things to understand what's really going on. And apparently, by the time Spring's Awakening was written, the children, it was very rarefied poetry. It wasn't what we're talking about, this rough and tumble alternation of Dionysus and Apollo, you know. And so that's what so he echoes way into Frank Wedekind. We still haven't caught up with Frank Wedekind in a lot of ways in terms of the range. And he wrote wonderful fairy tale plays. He wrote a play about a real estate developer, basically, called The Marquis of Kythe. He wrote a female Faust, actually, that's only recently been translated and published in English. So I just picked that up and I plan to read that. So
Okay.
he reverberates down the centuries, I think, Goethe.
Okay. Thank you, Doug. Ella, go ahead. Again, if you want to share something, go ahead and type in the exclamation point in the chat, and we'll call you.
Yeah, a lot of great comments and insights. I was thinking that, you know, Faust is caught up in such an ego trip that, and he spent his time on the earth, and as you said, he's probably in his 50s, getting degree after degree and so forth and so on. Nothing wrong with that. That's certainly important, or it was to him. But he doesn't seem to have developed much depth as a human being, and beyond reason and intellect. So from the alchemical standpoint, which we had talked about last time, runs throughout this as a theme throughout this play, he would need to make that journey, and to be, you know, and from a Jungian standpoint, he would need to make that journey from ego into the self, which could be quite disorienting. And all of these things that are coming up for him now, as you said, very rapidly, have been repressed in his life. He hasn't allowed himself all of these sensory pleasures. So now they're all coming up. The shadow is being formed and so forth. And so I'm wondering, is it perhaps that this is a hero's journey? Because in one sense, or is it a failed hero's journey? In one sense, in one ending, Faust, and I don't want to, you know, Faust doesn't end up going to hell. And in the other ending, you know, he makes it by virtue of Gretchen's love, which is a great virtue. So I guess in one sense, with one ending, he's going to get through all this stuff. And it's essential that he goes through this journey to get to the self, which is in Christianity, Jesus, wholeness. And then and according to Jung, you know, from a psychological standpoint, that's wholeness. Or is he going to, you know, I don't know which ending. I haven't finished this version, so I don't know if it's going to be a failed hero's journey, because
Go ahead, Ella.
I'm almost done, because I don't know if it's going to be a failed hero's journey, because he did consort with the devil, and he's going to end up with, you know, unfortunate circumstances at the end, or if it's going to be successful in the end because there was enough wherewithal, and he made a very difficult descension into chaos with all of this. So those are my thoughts.
Right. No, thank you. That's very good. I'm not going to spoil it for you guys if you haven't read to the end yet. I will mention though that in Marlowe, it's a failed journey, but we'll see what happens in this one. But I do want to suggest that we have another type of development going on here. So Faust gets rejuvenated, presumably, by drinking this potion. And I was thinking about the following. It seems to me that maybe he makes the journey of what a teenager, the same journey as a teenager makes in becoming an adult. You start out with partying and drinking, and then you get an affair with a you get a girlfriend and you do all of that. And then at some point later in life, you realize, okay, that's not enough. And you start aspiring to something a little more beyond your own little sphere of influence. And of course, part two is where we get into that larger sphere. But part one is pretty much the sensual experience, right? The immediate, the kind of the lowest level that most people really are in a lot of ways are happy to operate on. And that's kind of their life is just kind of like the partying and the sexual experiences and kind of the not just sexual, I would say sensual, right? Everything that we can touch and experience and on a material level, that's a way to live. And Faust wants to experience that too, as well as other ways to live. And that was his kind of bet with the devil, is you can show me all of it and none of it is going to bring satisfaction. So the devil is fulfilling his part of the bargain and showing him different ways to live, in a sense. Now with Gretchen, it becomes more complicated because while it starts out as mere, you can say lust, right? And the word is actually used in German. I think the word is called Lusternheit, root being lust or lust, translated as passion or passionate desire. But then it turns into something more, it seems. So as you read when Faust enters Gretchen's room, and Doug, I think you spoke about this, that places have a certain spirit around them. When he enters her room, the spirit of this young woman who he doesn't really know her. I mean, he just saw her once, but he enters her room and now all of a sudden it's like he knows her. He sees how tidy everything is. He sees how Spartan it is, how it's so everything is in its place. And also he gets some preview of her character because she rejects him because she knows that's her moral obligation to reject him, even though she wants to do the opposite. She wants to talk to him. She wants to engage him. But I guess the Freudian superego is telling her, no, you can't do that. It's not acceptable. You have to tell him to leave me alone. And she does that. But then later she regrets it, and she's wondering about who is this man that accosted me on the street, and he's very interesting. And it's just such a humanly identifiable story that I think happens all over the place when you have a person who, from a higher station, he encounters a woman from, maybe kind of a simple conditions of life, and the two hit it off initially, and it kind of seems to go well. But then what happens in the devil, Mephistopheles, he's already seeing what's going to happen, that the two of them are not really compatible in their goals. Margaret is all about kind of the idyllic romantic relationship, but Faust is not ready to be tied down. And of course that spells trouble, that spells a tragic end to this right away. But Faust is nonetheless quite happy to take advantage of her while he's at it. So we got that going. Yeah, okay. Brian, and then Madeline.
So I did spend some time reading Faust 1, and then I looked on YouTube. There's a production of it that came out very recently. Shoot, I think it's Peter Stein.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I watched that, and it's in German, but it's got the the captions in English. The I watched that and I thought that really helped me because some of the dialogue is really tied into the setting and the set. And of course, the set indicate the staging is not that clear from the book, but it's really made, I think they do a good job making it very clear in the when they act it out. And that really helped me a lot in just understanding what's going on. I think a lot of the memorable phrases are just kind of reflections on what's going on. Yes, there's the story, and the action, but then there's also there's reflections on it from Mephistopheles and Faust and even others. I thought was very interesting, and that's the part I was able to tease that apart. Just the action and the words needed to move the action forward from these sometimes very interesting observations. The one thing I picked up on, I didn't really appreciate before I'd watched the staging, at least as it's presented in the staging, is that Faust is kind of angry when he's in the studio. He comes across, he's presented as very angry. I thought when I first looked at this, I thought he was kind of exhausted, frustrated, exhausted, given up. And then Mephistopheles kind of draws him out and turns him to these other things, but that's not the way it's presented. He's still full of life in this and frustrated, but he's angry that he hasn't obtained the satisfaction he's looking for in all these books. So that was one thing. Another thing was how, a couple things. In the Aerbach's Cellar, that was not Goethe who took the initiative to go there. That was Mephistopheles. But the seduction of they call the woman Margaret in this book, or the girl is Margaret in the German. But the seduction was Faust's idea, and there it becomes very clear that Mephistopheles is as Mephistopheles agreed to be in the studio. Mephistopheles is his servant and slave. He does what Faust says. So Faust is really taking control in this in the second part. The third thing that interested me, the bargain is that if he says that this is so beautiful, if this is such a wonderful moment, I'd like it to last forever, then I will go to hell. I will go to hell and I'll be your slave. And that's, I guess Faust is confident that's not going to happen. So, but the interesting thing to me was in the play, the moment when one of the moments when that could have happened was when he's consummating this quest for Margaret, basically in bed, and that is not in the play at all. And they don't go back to this promise at all in the rest of the first Faust one. I didn't see any other reference. Gee, maybe he's happy now. Maybe this is a moment he'd like to last forever. That issue doesn't ever come up again. So I thought that was very interesting.
Right, no, for sure. And I think that's highly significant that it did not happen for him just by being with her physically, because that's not enough. As much as men seek for sexual experience, it's not enough to satisfy forever. And especially for Goethe, a man who is so rich in his experience of life, art, science, knowledge, governing, women were definitely part of his life, as you yourself have alluded to. Goethe himself has had many affairs with women in his long life, but that by itself definitely was not enough for him. And so Faust, who he perhaps models after himself in some ways, definitely would not be satisfied just with a sexual experience. He would not want to be kind of like the Islamic version of paradise, where you're stuck with these virgins forever, and that's kind of the epitome of human existence. That doesn't seem to strike a chord with him as a pinnacle of what we're aspiring to. But the other part, of course, is this idea of limitlessness, right? So in heaven, God says, as long as men keep striving, they'll keep erring. But the idea is you keep erring less. You keep striving and you keep making smaller and smaller errors, and as you get to some sort of perfection. And if you stop striving, that's the point at which you're damned, because there is no improvement after that. You've stopped yourself from improving, from going forward. At least that's the idea of progress, enlightenment, etc., which again, for all we know, Goethe is critiquing and making putting it to question whether or not this idea of perpetual improvement is even a possibility, or is it some utopia, some dream? I mean, we all live like it's not, and that's fine. But the book definitely raises these questions with Faust, trying different avenues and failing so much in different ways. So anyway, I thought, let's see, who do we have?
I think Penny wants to say something. Penny's my wife. She's here too.
Okay. Penny, can you hold on just a second, just because we had a few other people, and then I'll give the floor to you. So Madeline and Allison, and then Penny.
Okay.
Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Penny. I was thinking about Gretchen not as, excuse me, not as a kind of stock character of the good girl who goes tumbling down, but in terms of Jungian psychology. When we think of Jung, my understanding of it is that every man has a sort of a female aspect to himself inside himself called the anima figure. And every woman has a male aspect inside herself, the animus. And whichever one you are and have inside you, that's the thing that in a way is sort of the most other about you. It's you, but it can be a part of you that you don't see. And it's can be your interface with the world in ways that you don't understand. So I started thinking about this in terms of Faust and Gretchen, and thinking, okay, what if we were looking at Gretchen as Faust's anima figure, and what if we looked at Faust as Gretchen's animus figure? So I'm going to start with the latter. I'm just kind of rambling here for a minute. I think that for Gretchen, she does live a very limited life. She's a very conventional young woman, and she's had a number of hardships, which were not atypical for the time. If you didn't have money, you would, if you were the oldest girl, you would be raising the other kids. You very likely might have a parent who had died. So she'd had a tough time with it, but she was very content in her sphere. And for her, the realm of the limitless was to be found in the church, was to be found in the rituals and symbols of religion, in the practices, and especially as a group practice. Whereas we see with Faust, his whole thing about spirituality has nothing to do with a group practice, group worship. So she seems very circumscribed, but finds her limitlessness in religion. So what about Faust as her animus figure? So what about Faust as Gretchen's male aspect, where he is intellectual, he reads a lot, he has no family responsibilities, he travels, he has this evil roguish friend. Then from the other side of things, I think it's it's more obvious about Gretchen being Faust's anima figure. But the thing that the two of them have in common is a desire to go beyond, in a sense, that she's doing it through religion, and then she does it through transgressing the social norms because she has found love. And love is what's human love, eros, is what's going to take her beyond, she feels. Whereas Faust is looking to go beyond as well, thinks he will find it in her, but doesn't. So there's a sense in which in this whole area of the play, Faust has encountered his anima figure and briefly united with her, kind of tasted his pure female aspect of his soul, and then rejected it and rejected the fruits of that union. So that might be akin to an artist praying for inspiration, getting a taste of what it's like to be ridden by a muse, and then just rejecting the whole idea and going back to something safe. Even if the safety is wandering around drinking and saying like, oh, I'm looking for something. Looking for something might be less frightening than actually finding the thing and having to grapple with it in an intimate way. And so I think he refuses the burden of the union of the two parts of his soul.
Interesting. I mean, definitely an unusual interpretation, Madeline. But thank you for that. That's quite a novel way to look at it. Who do we have? Allison and then Penny.
Yeah, I was thinking that I feel like, this whole thing of, and I've known people like this, like college professors, where their entire lives were in their mind. And it's almost like they were divorced from their bodies. But I feel like the thing is that ultimately you're not truly experiencing life if you're disconnected from your body as well. So I think that, with the devil showing him, the drink and the women and all of that, it's connecting him to his body and his physical sensations. But I really, I like this theme of that, you can have your intellectual life and then you start to have a romantic life, but that ultimately is not, it's like none of these things are enough because you need all of them to be a full person. And I think the whole reason that, women stopped being housewives and started working was for the same reason. It wasn't about trying to make money. It was about recognizing that there's a person other than just being a wife and a mother, that there's and I think all of us, men, women, everybody, we have all these different sides to us. And we want romantic love. We want intellectual life. We want adventure. We want, a spiritual side. And it's natural that we need all of those things. And when we're living a life where we're shutting down any aspect of that, we're not really satisfied and happy. And, it shouldn't be a competition between this kind of life and that kind of life, and just recognize that we can have all of it. And sometimes it's hard to have all of that at the same time. Sometimes one part takes a back burner, like when children are young or something. And, there's a time when you're studying and there's a time when you're pursuing love. But ultimately, if we have all of those things in our lives, then we are much happier and more grounded as people.
Interesting. I have some comments about that, but I'll wait till Penny says what she wants to say. But thank you, Allison. That's great. Penny, go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to say, I mean, I have never read it before. I find it, it's very entertaining. This is the Greenberg translation, and you just read it, and you can. The language is so vivid that the characters really come to life. But the thing that I was kind of thinking too is Faust is a person who was thinking he could go beyond through his intellect. And so he was studying all the time and trying to discover all the secrets of the universe in his way, but then he got very frustrated because he had not, entered into like a normal life where you would be out with people and have a family and stuff like that. He was just all trying to do it in his mind. But then he hooks up with the devil. And if you hook up with the devil, who it basically is gearing you to just be totally self-centered, think only about yourself. And he presents them with tidbits of life that he says, oh, well, people like this, people like this, people like this. But of course, there could be other things like that he doesn't present him with because he's the devil. So he meets this girl, and maybe I'm romantic, but you kind of think, well, maybe then he would get into some deeper human relationships, and he could find other things in life that, I don't know if it's limitless, but it's definitely a way to explore life, or even doing things for other people, or considering yourself as part of society, which the devil, of course, doesn't. He just says, here, I'm going to put you in these situations. So then, of course, I think that, he doesn't find satisfaction, and the devil is the devil. So, he's kind of, I think, trying to make everything not work out, really, because like with the people in the wine, just in the bar scene, and then, he gets kind of bored with them, and they're kind of starting to be a little bit obnoxious. So, he turns it into fire. And so, he's not trying to really make things work out for Faust, and Faust is just following along in the book. And you would think that if he had used, his own mind a little bit and tried to figure out for himself what he might want more than just what the devil gave him, then it would have been different.
Right. Well, of course, the setup is, the whole point of it is that he needs a guide, right? He has exhausted his own ability to navigate this world. He's frustrated. He has tried everything he knows how to do, and he knows how to be a scholar. He studied all these disciplines, theology, medicine, jurisprudence, and none of it has given him satisfaction. So then he turns to magic. He conjures up the spirit of the earth. The spirit of the earth comes, overwhelms him. He doesn't know what to do with that. Although in the reading for today, we have him kind of reminiscing about the spirit of the earth with some fondness, and he treasures this experience, which is the experience of kind of like raw nature and the power of nature, which is something that, if you've ever stood by like an enormous waterfall or have seen an ocean, the sheer power of that does have some kind of spiritual dimension, I guess, but it's still not enough for him, and so he turns to the devil. So I guess the idea is, well, if he couldn't do it himself, then now he kind of has to rely on a guide. And of course, this idea of a guide is paralleled very well in Dante and in other places where you have kind of an apprentice and a guide type of relationship. And Faust is, some of you mentioned that the devil is kind of his servant, and in a sense that is true because they have a deal and he has to abide by that deal. But in the other sense also, there is some room for disagreement and for back and forth. So initially Mephistopheles says, why did you pick her? She is kind of the worst possible choice. She is not sinful. She's an innocent girl. I have no strings to pull with her. So they come up with this elaborate scheme with the jewels, and which backfires because her mom, who has a very, very keen nose for the devil, smells that something is not right here and just gives away the jewels to the priest, which obviously is very frustrating for both Faust and Mephistopheles, and it's funny. And then they have to try something else and put another box of jewels in there. And so there's a lot of the back and forth, and kind of, it's not a straight definitely not a straight path. I mean, there's a lot of detours back and forth. And also this, we have a couple of secondary characters that I thought were still interesting. One is, of course, Margaret's neighbor, Martha, who is in some ways the enabler of this affair, right? Because they meet in her garden. And it sounds like when Margaret's mother is very keen lady, but she's not omniscient. And so Margaret escapes to Martha's house and Martha's garden for these secret meetings with Faust. But Martha herself is a very interesting woman. And we have this very comical interchange with her and Mephistopheles about her husband, who dies without leaving her a penny, having spent all his money on prostitutes and supposedly, of course, we don't know that because that's just the story that Mephistopheles gives her. But a funny story it is of the husband saying, "Could you please say 300 masses for me, serve 300 masses for me?" But I actually spent all my money on prostitutes after abandoning you, essentially. So it's a very entertaining story. Then we have another scene at the well where you have another girl, Lysen, who relates a story to Margaret about a girl who was caught in I guess not adultery. I guess it would be more like just extramarital sex, fornication in the biblical terminology, and has gotten pregnant apparently, and now that's it. Her life is over. And of course, Margaret at this point is already probably knows she's pregnant herself, and it's a blow to her and just a reminder of her plight. But there are all kinds of interesting social references that come up there. First is this idea that society was very judgmental, I guess, of any sort of transgression of sexual nature. I mean, and Margaret herself says that she would have been the first to cast a stone at a transgressor, but now that she has done it herself, she is not so quick to judge. And of course, everyone else is in the same camp. And so this whole idea that it's not just men who are perpetuating this, women are going along with this whole program quite well. So you have the women who are they're guarding this tradition of, if you step outside of this, we're going to call you whore just as quickly, in fact, probably quicker than the men. Now, the men will execute you, but we will definitely make sure you're miserable all the way through. And there's something about that, I guess, when you see someone else transgressing and you yourself are abiding by the rules, you want the transgressor to suffer, right? I mean, we know how that feels. We all know, like, people cutting a line, we all wish for something bad to happen to them when they're cutting a line in front of us. We're standing, we're abiding by the rules, and then someone else comes in and cuts in front of us or does something similar. So all of that is very much, I think, at play here as well. The kind of the social norms of the times, and Goethe is very artful in presenting that. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on that. Madeline, do you want to say something else?
Yeah, but it's along these lines.
Okay.
Or I can make it be along these lines somehow.
Well, I do have one other, if you want to hold off, I do have one other passage that I was curious what you guys thought of. And that's the passage where Margaret interrogates Faust about his belief in God. I thought that was a very interesting passage because Faust is he's like an eel. He doesn't commit to a particular answer, but he's very much in the spirit of the romanticism and the kind of the almost like pantheism of God is in everything. And he makes the statement, again, I don't know how it's rendered in your translation, but in mine it says, "Feeling is all. The name is sound and smoke, beclouding heaven's glow. Feeling is all. The name is sound and smoke, beclouding heaven's glow." What do you guys think about that article of faith from Faust? I thought it was a particularly interesting this, especially the line about feeling is all. In other words, it doesn't matter how you call God, by what name, what religious observance. It's all about the general feeling that you get when you think about the universe and the creator and so forth. Ella, you think you have something to say about that?
Yeah, I think it's the opposite. I think he's enveloping the opposite. He's going into feeling function instead of the thinking function. And he's applying it to the world, to God, to the universe. And instead of integrating it into his whole being, which seems to be his overall plight, he isn't integrated. And he's trying to integrate the opposites throughout, the sensory experiences, et cetera, with his intellectual experiences and accomplishments. And he's having difficulty doing it. And I just think he's trying to be a whole person. And yeah, I think he's going off sort of the deep end. Everything's all, about feeling now and about emotions.
So you're saying he's sort of like vacillating. He's not really sure what he believes. He's trying different belief systems.
Yeah, but I do think, he's going to have to do this on his own to go into the problem is, he isn't doing this on his own. He's enlisted the devil to help him. He's weak. He's not on his journey. I mean, sure, he's experiencing all these things. Granted, I get that. That is going to help him to grow as a human being, as a person, to become whole, to become one with his deeper self, and less ego, more self. The ego still needs to remain, alive and well to function, but he needs to incorporate the self. And he's having a heck of a time kind of integrating everything. And he's enlisted the devil, and, he just needs to, he's a bit of a victim. He's a bit of a marionette. He's being controlled by other people. That's not the journey.
Ella, you gave me an idea for rewriting Faust, and maybe Doug, you can take up this with two guides instead of one being Freud and the other one being Jung. And that's the plot.
I love it. Do it.
Absolutely.
For sure.
Madeline, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Ella. That was very insightful, because now I'm seeing Faust as a symbol of the messy journey of individuation in life. He's clearly an intuitive thinking type. So here he is in the world of feelings and senses. I think as to what Phil said about his spirituality, it is very romantic. It is very much the spiritual feeling of the individual. It entails no social obligations. And in fact, his lady love is horrified that he's not a Christian. He doesn't come out and say so, but he doesn't use any words from the sort of church language of believers. I just wanted to go back to him not wanting the child, because what came to mind was the other book that we read in this group, Demons. Remember that man? It was like Schlotkin or something. And near the end of the book, his wife, who he'd married many years ago and hadn't seen in years, just turned up on his doorstep, heavily pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
And he greeted her with cries of joy and took her in, and she gave birth, and he was ecstatic. The child was clearly not his, but he was just delighted that he was going to have a family. And it was so such an extreme contrast. Because in a way, what can't think of his name, the character in Demons wanted was ultimately was the sort of politicality, that's not the right word, but anyway, of a life rooted in Slavic traditions. Whereas here, Faust really is not looking for a rooted life, which is what he would have with Margaret.
Well, indeed, because to have a root means you're tying yourself. That's not unlimited. That you can't experience life to its fullest and raise a family at the same time, any more than you can be on a farm and do that. And so anything that would tie him down becomes an obstacle eventually for him. And that's why I think, even without getting to part two, and again, we can debate, once we get there, we can debate on how contrived it is or not. But it is the tragedy of Faust is something that is probably universal for all of us as human beings. And I was thinking of Freud and his Civilization and Its Discontents. It's a small book, but very powerful and poignant in that it points out that being human means suffering. It's just, make a choice. Do you want to be human, or do you want to not suffer? You can't avoid suffering, but that means you will no longer be human. And a lot of times we choose no suffering, which seems maybe preferable for a time, but then we cease to be human. And the obvious example is drugs, right? You can take a particular drug and feel euphoric, and you can get to a point where that's your reality, and it's much more vivid than your reality without drug. But you're not a human being at that point. You've ceased to be. You've become something else. Whether it's a better state or worse state, we can argue, but it's not a human being anymore. I was also thinking of Aldous Huxley and The Brave New World, because it's the same idea. You take something that changes who you are fundamentally, and you no longer operate on the human level. You operate on a different level, and therefore you can no longer identify with Shakespeare, and you can no longer feel what they felt, because everything has been, I guess, standardized and packaged into a particular formula where you're in that kind of box. But I guess the point being is that this idea of finding satisfaction in one thing, it almost, according to Freud, it's futile. According to Dostoevsky and some of the other religious writers, you find it in some sort of religious experience. In Goethe, from what it looks like, it seems also pretty futile, because no matter what you do, you're cursed almost. And Margaret expresses it in this way. She says, when she talks about Mephistopheles, she says, "This man, I shudder in his presence, because he's cold as ice. And it's clear to me that he doesn't love anyone." And that's the key part, where Faust is becoming the same way. He doesn't love anyone anymore. I mean, initially he loved her, but then he's willing to do all kinds of atrocities to reach his own goals. And in a Kantian sense, he's not treating her as a person. He's treating her just as means to his own ends, right? Which is immoral, and destroys her brother, destroys her mother, destroys her child. I mean, it's just path to destruction. And but it's a really powerful example of this following this path of, I guess, lovelessness. And one other quick note is that Mephistopheles, as much as we like him for his wit and his sarcasm and his kind of quick witticisms and all of that, he is cold as ice. He doesn't love anything, and that really comes through quite clearly in the book. The more we read it, is he doesn't care. I mean, he has his own ends. He's sort of like a nihilist in a way, and maybe in Dostoevsky sense, he just wants to destroy everything and see everything burn, but he definitely doesn't love anything. Okay, we have a lot of people here. Let's see, Allison and then Doug.
I think one of the problems with Faust is that he's going through this phase at the age of 50 that he should have gone through when he was 20. And like none of these things would be all that bad if he was 20 years old. But the
Would
fact
they
that
though?
well, they still would. Getting her pregnant and bailing is bad no matter what age you are. But you would think that a man at 50, usually by then they'd have kids. Yeah, usually they're already grown up. But he would be welcoming of it. But this man is just running from this because, it's like he's having this like adolescence that he didn't have when he actually was that age.
Hmm.
And I was thinking that it sort of reminds me of, as we were talking about it, it actually reminds me of what ballet dancers do. Honestly, like they live this incredibly rigid, constricted life with no social life, nothing, for years and years and years. And then lots of times by the time they get to be about 20, they'll quit, go to college, and they just sort of kind of like go crazy for a while. And sometimes you see it in, really prestigious colleges where these kids, they did nothing but study so they could get to that school. And then they just kind of like lose it because suddenly they have this freedom. But the difference though, is at least they're young and he's, like he should have done all these things years and years ago. And so now it's like, he's not acting at all like his age. He's just acting like a middle-aged 20-year-old, and it's no one's fault but his own, but he's just wrecking, catastrophe in his path.
Interesting. I mean, I don't know what to say there. Yeah, Doug, go ahead.
Sow your oats while you're young. That's what I say.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting, Allison. I was going to comment on, what Ella and Madeline have talked about the Jungian influences and Freudian and different aspects of that. I think that's very astute and very valuable, and partially because they were so influenced by Goethe. I think that, but also Otto Rank is an interesting figure because he was a favorite of Freud's, after Jung was, ostracized or, exiled, and even to the end, Freud liked him, but Freudian disciples hated Otto Rank because he actually put the birth trauma at the center of psychology, not the Oedipal conflict, which he thought was secondary, that emerged later. And that was complete, blasphemy within particularly the British and American medical doctors. But Freud actually wrote an essay on lay analysis where he said, the medical training actually dehumanizes people, and that women might be better psychologists than doctors and mothers and people who understood certain other elements of life. And he actually posits that. There are letters between Freud and Rank that I read about 5 or 10 years ago, and they're very, very interesting. And how he had to finally come to America, and he actually, Otto Rank, identified with Huck Finn, and he ended up using that label after he moved to America, that he was the outlaw, and he knew more about literature and culture and history than most of the doctors who were Freudians. And so they just never forgave him for that. So it's another name to consider in this.
Interesting.
But I do think, I think the idea that just one other quick thing, that Faust is the animus figure, and that he has this wingman that, Allison referred to. And for Jung, the animus often showed up as gangs of unruly men. And this play is riddled with gangs of unruly men. And so the animus figure can be a lone figure, but can also be a pack of wild animals or a pack of wild men or outlaws or that sort of thing. So it's very interesting. But that attempt for wholeness, which gets back to the Dionysus and the Apollo, you don't worship one, you maybe have a balance of the two, which is not easy.
What do you guys think about the idea of nature versus or relation to nature in this Faustian age that we're in. So obviously, civilization has been moved forward by us slowly departing from nature in every possible way, to the point where now we live in total isolation from it, in cities, and we're kind of in these brick prisons of our own making and so forth. But the idea of the natural versus unnatural, and the idea of limitation versus unlimited. So nature obviously provides some built-in limitations for a human life, from pretty much every aspect, right? Longevity, youthfulness, the type of things you can do if you live, again, keep going back to this idyllic farm existence, right? Or even just a family life, the physicality of it, the locality of it, right? It puts inherent limitations, whereas the age that we're in, which we've inherited from Faust, and I guess is part of the Western civilization, is all about having everything. I guess this touches back on the idea that Allison brought up about a fulfilled life is where you have a little bit of everything. Well, that's kind of, I guess, the American ideal. I can be a philosopher, a jiu-jitsu fighter, a scholar, and a ballerina all in one. Kind of basically the idea of, we don't like limitations being put on us in any possible way. So I can be a president, I can be this, I can be that, all in one, lifetime. And if you tell me I cannot, we really don't like that. I mean, none of us do. We do not like limitations. We cannot stand limitations of anything. And of course, that's where we clash with nature, because nature is all about natural limitations. So what do you, I'm just curious, anybody has any thoughts on this? Is this something that rung a bell for you or not? This is a kind of an open question to anybody who wants to chat or. Yeah. Again, it seems to me as a recurring theme here, because of Faust versus this earth spirit, and in the midst of Faust's romantic encounter with Margaret, we have this scene where he's in the forest cave and he is addressing the spirit. You would think, well, he's involved with Margaret, why isn't she enough? And yet, right in the midst of all of that romantic, his romantic affair with her, he is having this private moment where he is completely doing something completely different, trying to get back to nature and trying to get back in touch with the caves and with the moon and with the, with all these natural forces. And then of course Mephistopheles shows up and makes fun of him and says, what are you doing? You're going backwards, not forwards. You need to stop being, what does he call him, a toad or something like that? So stop being a toad in a rock. Go get her. Go get the girl. You're losing your focus here. So I'm just curious if any of that is interesting to you. Allison, go ahead.
I think that's kind of what makes us human, because like a bird doesn't want to be a tree and a tree doesn't want to be a bird. But as human beings, we always are trying to change things. And, whether we're changing our environment or we're picking up and going to a different environment, sometimes you think, like, why do people get on little itsy bitsy boats and sail across a big giant ocean? Like, who in their right mind would do such a thing? But we did. And, why would we go up to the moon? Well, we want to see what's up there. I mean, it's just a very much a part of being human, is that we always want to see what's beyond the horizon, and we're not ever satisfied with what we have. And that really is a very human thing, because a beaver will build a dam, but they're not building a skyscraper. And they're especially not like, I'm going to build them bigger than yours, look at me, I'm the winner. But it's very much a part of being human. It's kind of weird, really, but it is kind of.
I totally agree with you, except I would say that it is a particularly strong aspect of Western culture in general. I think the Eastern cultures are not as craze bent on kind of pursuing the stars. Now, to the degree that they've Westernized, and I think China would be like a great example. China for thousands of years have been isolated. They did not want to go anywhere. They didn't want to explore anything. They built a wall around them, and they wanted to function within that wall, right? They wanted to have a completely limited experience. It's almost to me like or Japan is another really probably good example as well. Now, as soon as they got westernized and the Western ideals, I don't, maybe polluted is not the right word, but they became part of their consciousness, things have changed. They've become imperial, right? China is expanding. Japan, did the same thing at the turn of the 20th century, became imperialistic. So is it a human trait, or is it a particularly Western trait? I'm curious about that, because I don't know, maybe we think that we're so universal in our Western world that it kind of just a human trait, but maybe not.
It is, yeah, and it is really very Western in a way. Like this morning with the Thinking Society, Joe led a discussion about businesses that expand, and what makes them successful when they expand. But really, why would you want to expand? Because that's really like trying to have an empire.
See, you're contradicting yourself.
Like you could have your own little business and you're very successful and you're good, but no, you decide you want to open up 40 branches of it all over the place.
Right. No, I'm with you.
You
I'm
want
with
your
you.
empire.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really, you don't really need it to survive. If you're successful with your one restaurant, that should be enough, but suddenly you're putting them all over the planet.
Well, that's where you have to, you go back to somebody like Machiavelli, and he would say, if you don't grow, somebody else will, and they'll eat you up. So there's your answer.
There is that. Yeah, there is a little bit of a self-preservation in it, but there's some greed in there too.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Ella, go ahead.
So I'm thinking that this may go back to something you mentioned earlier, Philip, and that was pantheism. That maybe this is about everything being one, everything, everybody, all of matter in the universe, multi-universes being one. So, it's part of his journey, and he's turning away, he's becoming more spiritual. It may not be in the traditional way, but he's going inward. He's in the cave. He's trying to find out the ultimate nature of reality, of the universe. I don't, Spinoza would agree with his searching for the answer in nature. As far as what is, and I think I heard you saying what's going on today, and is it just in the Western world, what's happened with nature? I don't think so. I think, of course, we may have led the way, but yeah, I mean, for instance, just one example, a lot of coal is being taken out of very beautiful areas in this country with a lot of hard work by our coal miners, which is very dangerous work, and being shipped to China. So it's like we're all involved in this now, who's to blame? The coal miner? No, they have no other way to earn a living in those particular areas. It's all run by the coal mines, who are owned by corporations, and then the fuel goes to New York, Chicago, all over the country to keep your lights on and keep your heat on. So they're not to blame, but it's a process, and it's destroying the earth. So it is and if we are all a part of one another, it's just sort of a disemboweling, figuratively, of ourselves. We're taking what's out of the earth. We're doing it in a vicious manner by blowing up mountains to get it out faster, They don't do deep mining anymore. And then we're blowing up the mountains, and then we're paying the miners a little bit, and then we're running them out of town and burning down their houses. This is what's actually happened in Appalachia. But again, it's corporations, and it's not the people who have to do these jobs to earn a living. So it's really deeply hurtful to everyone who's participating in it in any way, be it a stockholder, a foreign country getting the coal, all of us overly using our electricity, which is oftentimes fueled by coal and that sort of thing. We're all interconnected. That's my thoughts.
Right. No, I agree with you. I mean, I think to a degree, though, you have to say that the Western culture, Western civilization has taken over the entire world. I mean, it has won, let's put it this way. And so even countries in the East, they've bought into it. So they have exactly the same legal structure, corporate structure, every conceivable, philosophically, they've acquiesced to this way of life. And the reason for that is the countries that have not have been subdued and have been conquered. So really, the whole world now is a reflection of this ethos of unlimited expansion, unlimited everything. And to a certain degree, like you mentioned, it is destroying us, destroying our world. And my point initially was that it is actually, we're destroying nature, but we are part of nature. So it's self-destructive in a way. I guess that's the, I guess it's almost like a Greek tragedy of maybe Oedipus or anyone else, where you have this idea of you pursuing something, you can't stop, and yet whatever it is you're pursuing that you think will help you is actually destroying it. And
It's like the Ouroboros, where we talked about that, where is it a lizard? No, whatever it is.
Snake, yeah, its own tail,
It devours its own tail.
Yep. And yet it can't stop.
It can't stop.
Can't stop, yeah. So we're in that struggle together. All right, any other final points? We maybe have about 5 or more minutes. Any points before we close off for tonight? Doug, go ahead. Oh, you're on mute, Doug.
There's so many interesting things that are being said. I get more and more points as people talk. The limited, unlimited, I think that's a point to look at Mary Shelley. And the creator, the creature. She actually says he discovers the impulse of life, the energy of life, and then he has to design a container for it. And once he does, he runs away from it. He abdicates it. So it's a real send up of this male heroism that she got from her father and Lord Byron and Shelley, her husband, both worshipped her father as one of the great philosophers, but he couldn't run a household. He was not good at practical things, apparently, her father. And but that's one thing. The other is the miners is very interesting, because I think the Western culture has a number of things that make it oddly toxic. That other cultures honor the group more than this self-made man, the hero, or they honor a balance more than what we've done. And I think since 2008, the failure of the banks, the world was falling into an American model, but I think they've been desperate to try to find other models. And I won't go into that, but the miners is very interesting, because I did a lot of research into the American mines. And I was doing a show on gold, both the spiritual significance and the actual material coming out of the mines in America, and the gold fields in California, and the mines in South Africa. And, and gold was surging in price. They were aiming at $1,000 an ounce, when we were doing this play. And so a lot of different things. The interesting thing about the mines, that the American mines who had a Cornwall miner in them were safer. But then the corporations tended to get rid of those people because they were very safety oriented. This was 1,000-year practice, or even longer than that, 2,000 or 3,000 years. The practice of mining is a very ancient technique. But with the corporations, what would happen when somebody died in a mine, the whole mine would shut down, partially to honor the dead, but partially to figure out why did that accident happen? You know, it's like quality management. You stop the assembly line and say, why are we suddenly turning out lemons? You redesign it with the input of everybody, and you find a solution that makes the mine safe. Well, increasingly, it got to be just the friends, and then it got to be just the family who could take a day or two off to bury the dead, but not really deal with the safety issues. So there's a whole legacy of ancient technologies that's been abandoned for profit, for, you know, maximizing profits. And so you get these ironies of we're exporting coal to China. But the worst example of it is probably the Opium Wars, where England and America fought the Chinese to make opium legal in China. And most people don't understand that. Opium was illegal in China. It wasn't part of their culture. And we fought a war to open the drug market into China. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt's family, the Delanos, were one of the people who made a huge amount of money out of the Opium Wars in China in the 19th century. And that's a history we don't really learn about, how predatory the West can be, and what happened in the Aztecs when the Spanish went in there versus when the French went into North America. They intermarried and entered the native cultures, but Anglos and the Spanish were much more condescending. And so the racism involved in that kind of exploded in the LA City Council a few weeks ago, the racism within Latino cultures for indigenous people, Oaxacans and so forth. It's a very, very interesting problem. So I appreciate these comments, and they're coming really interesting ideas from the group tonight. Thank you all.
Yep. Madeline, go ahead.
Thank you, Doug. That was fascinating. I'm going to rewind the thread a little bit and go back to the beginning of what Ella was talking about, which is the Ouroboros, the snake in a circle eating its own tail forever. And that put me in mind of the snake of Norse mythology, the enormous serpent. And I've been looking into that a while back. There are actually two of them. There is the big one that encircles the world, encircles all that is. Then there is, then there's the world tree, which appears in other mythologies. So there's the world tree. There's a serpent that is gnawing at the roots of the world tree. That's a different serpent than the one that encircles the world. So since these would probably have been old legends that were available in Goethe's time, or certainly around in some sort of folk memory, perhaps, which serpent was it that Faust was dealing with? Was it that he aimed for the one that encircled the world, but got the one gnawing at the roots of the world tree instead, like Mephisto? Or did he already have that gnawing? And that's what drove him outwards towards the edges of the world.
Interesting. There are a couple of times when he calls out Mephistopheles as snake. I think it's Schlage in German or something like that, or Schlange. And yeah, Schlange. Thank you. Which is interesting, but it seems to me to be referencing more the serpent in Genesis, which tempted Eve, rather than the Norse mythology. Although Norse mythology is interesting and probably was already maybe was available to Goethe at the time. I'm not sure. I know it was really became popular towards the end of the middle of the 19th century there with Wagner and everyone else. But yeah, that's interesting. Curious if he had any connection to that. Any more comments or thoughts on the reading today? Any final thoughts you want to leave with us? I had one, just a quick note. We're reading in, I'm participating in our local book club, and we were reading Sappho. So in one of Sappho's poems, maybe one of the most beautiful poems that she has, it's about the apple that's reddening, the apple that's reddening at the top, that the pickers did not forget to pick, nobody could reach it. And of course, several times when Mephisto tries to assuage Faust from pursuing Margaret, he calls her a bloom that you want to pluck. And this idea of plucking a bloom and getting a fruit, and there's all kinds of sexual imagery there, which has to do with plucking a fruit, and which is pretty prevalent in literature in general. It made me think of Sappho and her picture of this apple that is unmatched, and it's not picked not because it's people forgot about it, but because there was no one to match its quality. And then right after that, there's a small four-liner of the shepherds going on a mountain side, and there's a hyacinth flower, and they trample it, and they don't even turn around to look at it. And in some ways, we have this, the story of Margaret is like that, in a sense, where she is just a collateral damage in some ways of this quest for unlimited experience, unlimited pleasure, unlimited, I would say experiences, really. That's what it's all about for Faust, just the high, the lows. We talked about, he wants the stars, he wants the kind of the dregs of experiences of society. So he's reaching for all of it. But then you have people that get involved in it, and tragically they become collateral damage and all of that. Okay, I think that's all the time we have for today. Thank you everyone for joining. It was a great discussion again. I hope you join us again for the next time. Next time we're going to be reading through to the end of part 1. So everything, Walpurgis Night, and then the ending of the tragedy of Margaret. Thanks again for joining, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Doug.
Thank you.
Thank you.